Hello, everyone. This is episode 8 of Life in Sport, and I'm delighted to be moving into the media a little bit. Conor McKeon, a journalist with The Independent, you're very welcome. I probably have done the least amount of preparation for this interview, which is probably very naive because our jobs are actually very dissimilar. How are you today, first of all?
I'm very well. Enjoying the sunshine, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to suggest we do this outside, but the amount of lawnmowers going, I think it probably wouldn't be a good idea for the sound. Conor, tell everyone first of all about your background in sport.
Well, like when I was younger, I think we played nearly every sport. We would have played, practically every sport that young people kind of play in Dublin. But particularly Gaelic football and hurling, would have played for Luke and Sarsfields because that's where we lived, and played for a local soccer team as well. But I suppose my father came from Artane, and my mother's from Dublin as well, and they would have had my dad would have been one of the sort of people who grew up kind of sort of bewitched by Heffo's army, and that was always a very, very strong kind of a presence in our house, the decades of the Dubs DVDs. And besides playing football and hurling, I think, the biggest sporting memories that I have were kind of going matches, GAA matches, kind of around the country. I suppose they're the ones that stick with you, going down on a Sunday afternoon to wherever you're going to watch Dublin or whoever else, like if there were teams playing in Croke Park, we would have always gone into league finals and things like that. The odd time I remember blagging a ticket for All-Ireland finals. So, well, the interest in sport would have been huge, and I would have played like golf and table tennis and boxing and nearly everything. I think the GAA was always the one that's in the back of your mind, and they were the sports that I followed most closely. So I suppose it was natural enough that, when I got into journalism, that would be the way I gravitate, because I suppose they would be the ones that they'd be exposed to most.
So were you one of these people that kind of knew early on that you wanted to try and make a living in sport? Like whether or not you knew you wanted to be a journalist, or whether you knew you could be onto a good thing, which sometimes is very naive because it's not the easiest life to choose either. But did you know early on?
Yeah, I was like, sort of unbeknownst to myself, I was really interested in journalism. I always read newspapers. They were always around the house. My dad read the Evening Press and later the Evening Herald, and I would have sort of started to buy newspapers myself, maybe younger than any of my friends did, or even like, a lot of my friends never did. And I was very interested in sports journalism. At the time, particularly a story like stories that stand out are like the Michelle Smith story or Saipan in 2001. The big controversies, not necessarily for the controversial element to it, but for the fact that sport was commanding the attention of the public. There was something very glamorous about that to me. We don't really have it anymore, because like we used to have it with television programs that everyone used to watch and come into school on a Monday and speak about. But I think sport is really the last thing that we all watch in unison. And, there's a new dimension to it now, that not only are we all watching the same sporting event at the same time, but we're looking at our phones to see what everybody's saying on Twitter about it at the same time. So in a weird way, despite the fact that we're all, in our own sitting rooms, it is one of the last kind of great communal experiences. And there was something about that I found to be really, really, I suppose, glamorous nearly. But I never, like every essay I did in school was like somehow sporting themed. And I love reading and I love writing. And like sports journalism for me would have been the most possibly glamorous job that you could possibly do. Which I think doesn't say an awful lot for a younger me. But in my head, it was like there was no way I was going to be able to do that. Like it was one of those things where I might read an interview with, Paul McGrath in the Evening Herald, and I'd be like, well, I can't do that because I don't know Paul McGrath. Like that's the kind of barriers you kind of mount for yourself. So I went off and did something different in college, and then realized I hated that, and then kind of came back to journalism a little bit later than I should have done it in the first place, just because I just didn't think it was an accessible thing.
That's interesting. You probably found though, like, what did you study initially then when you finished school? What did you go and do and hate?
I did business because like everybody I went to school with either did business or computers. Like, I mean, it was all very general. Nobody exactly knew what we wanted to do. And yet still, like I would have, at that stage, I would have had a big interest in club GAA, and I was going to matches for no other reason than I was interested. And I don't know, it was weird. I never made the connection between this is something that I do as a hobby and that I have an active interest in. And here's a job that you could kind of use that interest and whatever knowledge or contacts that you built up. It took a while for that penny to drop. Now, I still got into it at a relatively young age. I had a good friend of mine now who taught me music when I was a kid. Sean Potts was the deputy sports editor of the Herald, and he was a great friend of my father's. And his father was a great sort of his father was a great he was sort of the godfather of traditional Irish music in Dublin for a lot of young musicians growing up. But you know, we would have had a big interest in GAA as well, so we would have all traveled to matches together to watch them. And because Sean worked in the newspaper game and he knew people that were involved in the team, you know, in the car on the way down, we didn't just talk about the match. You know, he would have stories about the sort of characters the players were, and I found that to just be fascinating. I was instantly drawn to that, and I think through that, then I got into newspapers and reading some, you know, Irish sports journalists at the time. You know, people like David Walsh and Paul Kimmage, and you know, really, really brilliant journalism. And the way they wrote about GAA, and particularly, maybe not those specifically those, but Dennis Walsh and Vincent Hogan, and you know, the way they wrote about GAA, even matches I wouldn't be at, a Munster hurling final. That kind of really resonated with me, and I was drawn more and more to it. And it was through Sean that I made a contact and started to work in a quite, you know, at a covering club matches. But you know, until I started doing it, I didn't really think that I'd ever be able to do it.
That's mad. That's fascinating, because actually, you know, what you're talking about there, this innate, like this knowledge that you had built up, it kind of happened very organically because of the way you were brought up. And you know, the contact, even just the contact book, the network of people, like that's not something that everybody would have. And actually it's a massive tool when you're working, particularly in print journalism, because you're just chasing stories all the time. So in a way, you know, that was part of the hard work. Did you always write then as well? Like, you know, when you say you were going to club matches, even before before Sean got you a contact in a newspaper, did you write stuff, or were you just like taking in everything all the time?
Yeah, a bit of both. Like, you know, I was kind of fascinated with the scene itself. You know, like I suppose like what sports writers do is they kind of, you know, they build myths. You know, they build mythology around people. You know, and I kind of actively bought that mythology from other people that not only wrote about those sports people, but talked about them on the way to matches or in pubs afterwards or whatever it was. So there was something about that, and like it's a weird thing, you know. From again, like the two big strands for me growing up would have been music and sport, and the thing that I was fascinated with were people who reached a really high level in both of those things. You know, I'd be fascinated by musicians who were brilliant. Why were they brilliant? What was it about their character that compelled them to become brilliant? You know, did they have a greater level of technique because they practiced more, or were they just somehow more in tune with the music on a kind of, you know, almost a spiritual level? And it's the same with sports stars. You know, we're all drawn to the story of, you know, this guy's a natural footballer. He, you know, he came out of the womb able to kick off his left, which generally tends not to be true. But it's really interesting to examine that. And I think it's the same thing. You know, I was just kind of fascinated by people who reach a very, very high level of ability in things, who are kind of, you know, probably because I couldn't myself. So you're just kind of like, well, how did you figure it out? You know, and that's kind of what attracted me to write and draw about these people, because I'd be naturally interested in people telling those stories anyway.
I have a very, very similar background to you, except that it wasn't really traditional Irish music. It was more classical and jazz. I played clarinet for years, like probably until I was about 20, and then everything just kind of got in the way. But I would have been in orchestras and all sorts for years. And I think that thing that you're talking about is discipline. Yeah. Because, you know, you have to be so disciplined to, you know, practice your clarinet or practice your pipes, you know, when everyone else is out doing something else or going shopping, or you have a match and you have to train. And like, I think it's discipline, and I think it's something maybe quite independent to just really disciplined people who get that far. And like you, I mean, I'm not saying you didn't get that far, because I know you're a brilliant piper, but I never got that far in sport or music. But again, I was kind of fascinated by people that did. But I think it's discipline. I think that's what it is. I think that's the key ingredient.
Yeah, well, I read that book by the guy who's in Sports Illustrated, the Sports Gene. It's a really, really interesting
it's very
book.
good. I have
it's
it,
just a really, really interesting book, and not that it doesn't dispel the 10,000 hours myth, but it adds another level to it. It's like, well, you could practice. Me and you, Evanne, could start an instrument or a sport tomorrow, and we could practice for the same number of hours, but there might be something in your genealogy that will accelerate your development, and we hear an awful lot now, and it's become a cliche, and I regret the fact that it's become a cliche because I find it very interesting. Is they talk about the culture of a squad. You talk about the culture of the Dublin football squad or the Limerick hurling squad, and when people say that, people switch off because they hear it so much. But I think when they actually try and break down what that entails, it's actually fascinating, and it tells you more about why these teams are successful, because there's no doubt, for me and you and for other sports writers now, it's a weird stage. I think there's less and less access to what these teams are doing, so there's less public knowledge, there's less of an opportunity to tell their story, but I think there's more of a story to tell. People bemoan the lack of characters, and former intercounty players telling brilliant stories about how they all used to play cards on the bus on the way home and have a few pints, but the guys who are playing intercounty football and hurling now are elite athletes in every way, shape and form, everything that entails. And every year they're pushing the boat out a little bit more. Every year they're getting more expertise. Every year the best practice around sports science and tactical development, and even the sort of cerebral side of playing your game, that's constantly improving. And I have to say, from we spoke about being interested in why people became virtuoso musicians as well as brilliant footballers and hurlers and athletes. I think there's an active curiosity there, and that keeps you going, because for me there's nothing, if I was as an editor of a newspaper, I would, anything that arrived on my desk that was written by somebody, the theme of which was things used to be better in my day, would just bin it straight away, because that just means that you're in the wrong game now. The thing has moved on and you failed to move with it, because if you're not still fascinated by this, it's a long week to get through 5 days of work if you don't have any interest in what people are doing anymore.
Tell us about your week then. So for people who are interested in sports journalism as a career, because there's so many different ways to work as a sports journalist, and your job is different to my job. So what does your week look like, say in the height of championship, or even at the moment during the league? Like, it's so busy, there's so many matches because we're playing catch up in so many things as well. So like, do you get Monday off and then just go hell for leather for the week, or what way does it work?
No, Monday tends to be, we all work. So when I started working for the Independent, I was working across the titles in a kind of a full-time freelance role. Then I became exclusively working for the Evening Herald. More recently, that's back now to the Irish Independent. So we have a big GA reporting team, because the GA is a big part of the Irish Independent constituency. So we all work on a Monday, because that's the day we have an editorial meeting. Because you tend to find once the week starts, okay, on a Monday you might still be reflecting. If you looked in today's newspaper, for instance, or Tuesday's newspaper, but an awful lot of the stories that are in it would be follow-ups from what happened from the weekend. So your Monday kind of nearly looks after itself. But you also have an editorial meeting to plan for the week, because, like, once the week starts, if you don't have 4 or 5 things, particularly when you have a big enough team like we do, we have to make sure that not only are we covering all the important things, but also the fact that we're not all tripping over each other to, like when a big story breaks, say like the row between Clare and Wexford last week, we're all working different days, and we all have to make sure that there's no kind of cross wires. So, they can be good weeks when you have an unexpected story to cover. They can be busy because you spend an awful lot of time on the phone, particularly about a contentious issue. But covering the live story, I find, is much more kind of interesting. It'll get you through the day an awful lot faster than kind of scratching around trying to pretend that you're in an interesting week, but you're not. But what's great now is that there's so many games. So like, once you get into the week, like, we'll earmark maybe 4 or 5 features that different people will do for the week. Saturday is obviously the biggest day in the paper, so you take an awful lot of unique original material and put it there. You might have I think there are a couple of press conferences this week. RTE are having one on Thursday that I have to do, which is now by Zoom, which obviously it's not as time consuming. You don't have to go to Montrose or whatever, but that they're probably not, the interviews aren't probably they're definitely not as personable as they used to be. And then when you get to go to the match at the weekend, you're kind of sent to whichever match you have to go to, which if it's on Saturday, you'll end up covering it for the Sunday Independent as well as Monday's newspaper. If it's on a Sunday, then obviously you just do it for Monday's newspaper. And for me, again, I know an awful lot of the guys that do my job and have been doing it for a long time. They nearly dread the weekend, particularly this time of year when you might be spending 3 or 4 hours in your car on your own on a Sunday. But like that's the part of the week that I enjoy most. Again, if you're not enthused by going to the games, if you're not kind of fascinated by what's going on the pitch, if you can't, adequately break down what's going on and kind of make some form of analysis or learn something from it, you're probably in the wrong job. So, that's the bit that I like. You can be gone all day Sunday, but and I love Sundays off, but I very rarely have one. And I've been doing this for the last, 15, 16 years. So kind of used to it now. So because of that, I'd have a day off during the week. It tends to be Wednesday, which breaks up the week nicely. But we'd have a couple of, we might be doing a couple of big projects. So obviously the championship is coming very hot on the heels of the end of the league this year. So we'll do a championship supplement, like a big magazine. And because that's happening the week after the league final, we have to put in the plans into place now as to who's doing what. And then this weekend, I think there's over 4 days, there's kind of a series of features about the 1991 saga between Dublin and Meath, because it's 30 years ago. So again, they're kind of big projects that we knew a while ago we were going to do, that you kind of have to build into your week's work as well. So like it's okay. You can end up working an awful lot of late evenings, which can be hard. But again, like I wouldn't be starting at 9 o'clock in the morning unless there was a press conference on and something that was breaking. So it's an easier job to do, I think, when you're a bit younger, because your day is kind of yours to yourself. You can put your laptop away at 6 o'clock now and say, well, that's grand, I'm in for the evening. And then something happens at 9:30 that night and you have to turn something around very quickly. You have to ring somebody, get the story, make sure it's okay and get it sent. So like there's a bit of versatility involved, but I think mostly it works both ways.
Yeah, it sounds like nothing is very defined. So it must be difficult to switch off. I mean, obviously, if you're on a day off, you can fully switch off. But like you say, if you filed all your copy for the day and, there we go, I have a feature in, I have 3 stories in, and then something happens, like the Dubs get caught training during a COVID ban at 5 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is, you have to switch on at the drop of a hat. Does that happen often?
It does. The only thing about it is that, like, there's 5 of us that are, if you want to say, beat GA reporters with the Irish Independent, kind of working the daily beat. So on any given day you'd have 3 or 4 people working. So if that does happen to you, and you're the one that has to kind of drop everything and you have to shelve plans and features that you've written. Like there were features that we wrote in the last lockdown that never got published, basically, because all of a sudden the lockdown became the story.
That would break my heart if I wrote a few features. They never got out.
Yeah, well, and I can't publish probably a couple of them now, because the people who spoke to you, if you publish them now, be saying, I can't even remember that conversation.
Yeah.
But that's just, that's the way it is. And I think for newspapers or for media organizations, which are increasingly going online, which are now finding a way to generate revenue from digital content, which is obviously, the way things are just going globally, being versatile and being able to check a story or get a reaction to a story at any time of day or night, I think is probably one of the better skills that you can have as a reporter, regardless of what field you're in.
Yeah, that's so true. Do you find that is something that comes with time as well? I mean, I know you're doing this a long time.
Yeah, like the first few years you spend an awful lot of time ringing people that were never going to talk to you, and after a couple of years you realize the people, you don't waste time ringing people who aren't going to talk to you. Like I remember like starting off and you'd ring somebody 11 o'clock in the morning and they'd say, yeah, I'll do that with you, but I'm working, so ring me back at 6. So all of a sudden, your entire day is kind of, well, I was going to get this finished, and then you ring the person back at 6 and actually you realize that it was just a red herring to get you off the phone and they're never going to answer it. So you kind of learn those things too. But I think the longer you do any of these jobs, the more of, I wouldn't say credibility necessarily, but obviously you speak to more people. The best thing you can do in this job, I think, is spend a lot of time on the phone. even like you could be bringing people who are local reporters in counties. You could be ringing people in the GAA. You could be ringing whoever you have in good contacts. I think that the worst thing you can possibly do is kind of sit at home and read stuff off Twitter and, you know, kind of blag it that way, because, you know, I think the best stuff comes from actually going out of your way to pick up the phone and ring people and talk to them and build up a relationship. Like some journalists are, you know, are brilliant writers and they get off on the back of their writing ability. That's what gets them through in their job. But other people are just good at bumping into people when they're in grounds and making contacts. And that's an equally good skill. That's an equally good skill. So I suppose you have to find what it is that you're good at, you know, as well as having some sort of area that you'd feel confident putting your thoughts into the world about. So yeah, no, there is a bit of that. And I think, you know, making those contacts and making those phone calls, even though it can be awkward sometimes, you know, you're ringing people essentially asking them to do you a favor by giving you a piece of information or giving you a few words. And not everybody is as inclined to do that possibly as they used to be. But, you know, I think it is best practice in this job.
Yeah. And I think as well, like, not to be too kind of big-headed about the whole thing, like you don't know it all, and not to be afraid to ask people for those favors or ask people for a steer. Like, you know, anytime I was covering club matches, I would always ring a local journalist, like whether it was Tyrone or Carlow or whatever games we were doing. I'd always ring the local stringer, like whoever was covering the GAA beat in that county, because they'll have the information that you need for some sort of a background into how these two teams are going to go up against each other. If you're not going to club matches in Armagh, you're not going to know, you know, what way they're going to line out. So I think sometimes it's just about being a bit humble as well and realizing you don't know it all, like, and make the phone calls. Yeah,
like one of the big traps I think the journalists fall into, particularly sports journalists, well, maybe not particularly sports journalists, but they're the journalists that I am most exposed to. Is, you know, we fall in love a bit with our own opinions, and you know, you know, they're not anymore formed or sort of intelligent, or valid or right than anybody else. It's an awful affliction. But again, like I had to do a thing at the weekends now, kind of it's like a spread of previews. And 2 weeks ago, when you had football and hurling, and the first week of the ladies football, I think there was no camogie. I think there was, you know, 63 matches or something that I had to put the verdict on. Now, clearly, some of those verdicts weren't the most educated decisions I've ever made. So, you know, there's a certain element of blagging when it comes to
it's definitely a balance, because on the one side, like, you have to back yourself as well. If you put something in print, or, you know, if you say something on air or whatever it is, like, you have to back yourself. But on the other side, you know, I don't know, I find that is sometimes a hard balance as well, because you don't want to be the forceful, opinionated person either. Like,
no, and I don't think it comes across very well.
No, it doesn't.
You know, particularly when you're going to matches, and you know, you mightn't have seen a team for 8 months, or you mightn't have seen the team for 2 years when you go to some of the matches, and all of a sudden you have to, you know, form an opinion on the basis of what you saw. So
especially at the moment, it's impossible at the moment.
I think a certain amount of humility is probably a good thing, even if we all fall into the trap of not having it from time to time.
I think everybody does. Is there ever any kind of any arguments around, you know, who does what story? Like, if you have 4 or 5 GAA journalists working on the same kind of beat, as you say, and there's like a rake of stuff happening during the week, do you normally go to your editor, I want to do this feature? Or does the editor come to you lot and say, right, you're doing that, you're doing that, you're doing that? And then is there kind of, you know, not fisticuffs, but like, do people argue over what stories they want to do?
I'm just trying to think of the other people that I might get into fisticuffs, whether I fancy my chance. No, like we tend to, like, you know, Colm Keys is the GAA editor or the GAA correspondent of the Irish Independent. So, you know, all things being equal, Colm will take the big story of the day if he's working. But like, if I was on earlier that day and I'd already made 4 phone calls, you know, I dovetail with Colm and say, look, or with Frank Roach or with Michael Verney or Donncha, you know, and say, look, you know, I'm already halfway down the road on this. So no, like, you know, again, there is a certain amount in this job of kind of self-promotion, and that kind of builds egos, but we're all, you know, we're all making sure that the story, more than likely than not, if somebody else does the story, you're relieved, you know, you just say, but thankfully that story is covered. And you know, you tend to know on a Monday, like on a Monday, if there's one big row if the row at the weekend was the black card in hurling, you know, like Colin Key is going to do a column for Tuesday's paper, so that's going to be what his column is. So by Monday morning, I'll already be thinking of what's the secondary story, what's the other angle, what's the different feature. So I think more or less we work well, but it's easier to communicate now than it used to be. Like we used to have editorial meetings in the office on a Monday and 2 people might not be there, but actually, because we've all been confined to our houses over the last year, we actually, keep, like, as much as we all hate when the WhatsApp group starts sort of lighting up, any of our WhatsApp groups or the Skype meetings on a Monday, Zoom meetings, they are very handy. They do work well, because if you have a GAA team or any sort of reporting team with as many members as ours, well, like, the worst thing any of us can do is waste 2 or 3 hours working on a story that somebody else has already agreed to do. So no, that doesn't tend to happen. It tends to be, we tend to communicate fairly well. I like
good. So you have a cohesive team. Glad to see it. What's the most difficult, type of article to produce? Because for me, I would imagine one of them has to be on the whistle.
Yeah, I don't mind that so much. I kind of like, I like, you get into a kind of a rhythm and a flow of a match report, as in, I think the first while when you start doing matches, you start panicking and make sure you take everything in. But the more of the context of the match that coming into the game, the more you've already kind of half written the piece in your head, and it's just filling in the significance of what happens in front of you. So I don't mind that personally. Now, there can be times when you're doing,
for people who don't know, I should probably point out, it's when you have to turn around a match report. When the whistle is gone.
The only panic I would have in that is that you can be covering hurling matches sometimes when
I was just going to say, and they swing and swing and swing, and you don't know who's going to win, so you can't ride it until the end.
Yeah, I remember I had to do an on-the-blow report, and whatever about for online, you can obviously go back and ring the lads in the office and say, will you change that?
Yeah.
But I think I had to do an on-the-blow, literally on the blow. You're pressing down on the final whistle for the Kilkenny Waterford replay in Thurles. And if you remember that, again, Colin Fennelly got 2 great goals, and literally, like, the intro, the most important part of the piece, had to be written 8 times in the space of the last 2 minutes, because you just did not know who was going to win the game. And you had to make sure that your running play, your description of the match underneath it, wasn't in complete contradiction to what the first 5 paragraphs said. So yeah, you can, but again, it's like anything, like the more times you do that, the easier it gets. For me, the hardest, like, I love writing features. I love talking to people that are interesting, that have an interesting story. That's the bit that I like, and you can take a bit of time over that, and that nobody else is going to write that feature before you, so you can put your own slant on it. But I suppose the thing that's actually the trickiest is if there's some sort of legal element to it. It's a huge thing for newspapers to the libel laws in Ireland are very, very sort of old, outdated and stringent, and you can fall foul of them without actually making too big a mistake. And you have to make sure that if somebody is making a claim about somebody else, if it's controversial, that you actually put that claim to the person. And an awful lot of times that person won't answer the phone to you, so it can just be quite delicate, because you've been in a situation where you've flagged with the office what story you're going to do. They're kind of waiting on it, but then by the same time you have to make sure that you've given everybody, and if it's a contentious issue, the 2 people might be talking to you on the phone, but they might be kind of giving out to you at the same time. So
I presume you have a legal team like that you can speak dial though.
Yeah, no, I think all newspapers would do and have somebody. So literally, you have a piece, you send it, bang, what do you think? They come straight back to you. But the problem with it is, really, it can be hard to tell the full story of a story, given the way the libel laws are, because they can be so costly for media organizations. They tend to err on the side of caution, and erring on the side of caution an awful lot of the time can see a story completely shelved, or in some cases take the best parts out of a story, and like, you want to be fair to everybody that's involved in it too. Like, ultimately it will be your name on the story, but thankfully it doesn't happen very often, but just in terms of the delicacies involved, I think that one is probably the trickiest.
What do you think in terms of, like, I think most people who work in sport, particularly I think in sports journalism, are play sport to a certain point until maybe they get a bit too busy or too old or whatever it is, but they always they've always been interested in sport, and they've always kind of held that interest. It does mean though that a lot of the time, like you mentioned, you love the Sundays and going off to matches, and you know that for a lot of us is the highlight of the week. Is it tricky though do you find it tricky with like family life or social life or that kind of thing? I know like years ago, I don't work every weekend now, but I used to work every weekend for years and years and years. And it was around the time where people were getting married and, you know, big birthday parties and stuff. You just have to say no. And then you go into like you've got 2 kids, I've got 2 kids. I think it's probably fair to say it's tricky on the partners at weekends.
Yeah, well, thankfully, you know, they're very understanding all of the time.
Yes, indeed, all of the time.
No, like it is. I suppose you don't really appreciate how much, for instance, like Sunday is a family day until you actually get to spend one at home, you know, and like it's a great day to have at home. But having said that, if I was at home for a Sunday, pathetic and all as it sounds, you know, I'd probably end up sort of watching GAA on television. So, you know, like there is an element of that. You know, my wife is from Tipperary, horse and jockey, so if there's a game in Thurles, we'll kind of make a day or two out of it because you have to build that into it. Like it is easier when you're younger and you've got fewer things going on at home. Even from the point of view, if you're minding children during the day and you're trying to do a very detailed story, and you know, some of the stuff you're putting down is from memory, and some of the stuff you have to look up. You know, you can just miss things. You know, so that part of it can kind of get in the way. But no, you do, like even the last lockdown, as hard as it was not having games, you know, as hard as it was not having live sport, there was a lot to be said for having Saturday and Sunday at home. You know, it did make it easier. And I think the more that kind of that pull of, you know, normal life, or having to give up hobbies, or not doing the things that you used to do, I think it probably does make it harder to do the job. I think that's probably where there's a small bit of burnout that comes along with it, you know, especially when you're like, you could go to a match where there's 3 hours of traffic in front of you. To get to a match, you either get there 4 hours early, or you get there 5 minutes to throw in and you're having a panic attack outside the ground. And you know you're coming home, you have to deal with one manager who happens to be particularly cantankerous on that given day. You know, like that part of the day can kind of, you know, you can start the week off on the wrong foot, you know, by the time you get to Monday, if you've bad experience on a Sunday. But by and large, for me anyway, I still get a thrill out of going to matches. You know, I haven't kind of grown cynical to that part of it, at least. You know, even last year going to Croke Park in the empty stadium, as hard and all as it was, because like I love All Ireland finals, you know, like the morning of an All Ireland final. Been lucky enough to cover them. I think everyone in both codes since 2006 or thereabouts. Like I wake up, you know, and literally bound out of bed, because you know there's just a great buzz and feeling around town. But I think last year, without the people there, it just was not the same. And yet still there was a buzz going to it. Like you were still at an All Ireland final, and as rubbish as they were without supporters, you know, that was the Ireland final, you know, in 10 years' time when they're showing it on reeling in the ears, you were like, well, actually, I was there.
Yeah, oh, big time, yeah. It's funny you mentioned the word cynicism, because I think there is a good bit of cynicism sometimes in a lot of jobs in sport, but I think particularly media jobs in sport, because I think people outside of the media circle think it's more glamorous than it is. And if you think it's glamorous, it is not the job for you. Because it is not glamorous, and there are a lot of pulls on your time and your, you know, resources and your just patience, really. But it sounds like you still have the grow for it anyway. You haven't got to that point where you're like, don't do journalism, it's crap. It's, you know, because I hear a lot of that and it's kind of deflating.
Yeah, no, I probably, there probably is a shelf life. Like I went staff with DNO in 2006. So that's 15 years. And like there are elements of it that, you know, when you drag yourself, you know, down for an All Ireland press conference 3 hours away, and because it's an All Ireland press conference, the players are, you know, they mightn't physically have a script in front of them, but they're reading. It's tattooed onto the inside of their eyelids, I think. And I'm just like, this is kind of pointless. But like, thankfully, you know, I think with a lot of media, you know, the player engagement element of it has become so forced and so unproductive. I think media is actually starting to go away from that, you know, which is a good thing, because when I started out, it was only really around the time in GAA anyway that the commodification of player access had started, you know. So we were going to, you know, all these promotional press conferences for, you know, sportswear manufacturers, and you might have 10 players, and it was a big event, and it was actually, wow, this is a cool thing to go to. And now it's like, oh, let's go to this place, you know, and for a couple of hours to listen to some guy who doesn't want to talk and doesn't want to say anything, and me who doesn't really have anything interesting to ask him, because I know, you know, that element of it does wear a bit thin. But I think media organizations are starting to go away from that and realize that you can give insight, and you can tell good stories about the games and the people involved without necessarily having to, you know, perform root canal surgery on a budding young GAA player, which is what it feels like, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, it is. I'm kind of hoping it'll come full circle though, because I think some of the younger players in particular are starting to realize that if they do those crappy interviews, it's not serving anybody really. Because I mean, personally, if I do an interview with, like, I mean, I'm not going to name any players, but I've done this and I just have dropped it because it is useless.
Useless, yeah.
So not only are you not promoting yourself by getting the interview on the television, you're not doing your job that you're supposed to be promoting this brand. You know, because usually it's a brand, like you say, it's Lucasade, or it's, you know, it's somebody is hosting this event. I just drop the interviews because there's nothing in them a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I think people are starting to realize now that unless you give some nugget, just throws a bone, it's not going to get aired. It's not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting just what reading the Naomi Osaka story this morning, and I think it's an interesting thing, because particularly in pro sport, it's a very delicate ecosystem between, you know, the cash revenues that formula as, you know, prize money for elite athletes, and the kind of, you know, the promotion of products or the media presence. Like, that's all part of the same gig. So if somebody kicks one of the legs from the chair, like, the rest of the chair is going to collapse to some degree. The GAA is a much more nuanced environment because players obviously aren't getting paid. But the thing, like, I don't feel that any GAA player should ever be forced into doing a media interview if they're not comfortable doing it. That they absolutely should not have to do it. And I journalists that moan about access in that situation, you know, I can't listen to it. But I do know from talking to players who would have been involved in setups that were very, very coy about what they did in terms of media, that an awful lot of players actually enjoy doing it. An awful lot of players are quite happy to sit down and, okay, they might not want to give you a very deep insight into the next match that they're playing, you know, or their opponents or whatever, but they're interesting people, you know. And where the kind of tension comes is where they're actually put under pressure from management not to say anything. So you have a weird thing happening where they're being put up for whatever reason to do interviews, and yet they're being put under pressure by management because this is the message, you know, this is what we're saying and this is what we're not saying. And to me, that's just a very strange kind of dynamic. You know, I think there's a great opportunity for the GAA at the moment. The GAA seem to be kind of, I wouldn't say that they don't care, but, you know, we're at a stage now where, because of the pandemic, an awful lot of county boards are going to struggle financially over the next while. And I heard Kevin McStay last year talk about, you know, the problems involved in managing Roscommon in terms of their bills for nutrition and for travel expenses. And he had a very good idea that the GAA should meet those costs. So at least when it came to team preparation, all the money wasn't going on this, particularly in counties like Roscommon when you have so many players come up from Dublin. But I sort of think that should be expanded even more, and the GAA should say, okay, well, like, here's a charter that you have to sign up for. And for us to meet all your costs or whatever, you know, make 2 players available the week of the game, and the 2 players have to have played in the previous week's game or whatever it is, so that they can basically normalize media interaction with players. Because at the moment there's a strange tension that goes on in any interaction between media and GAA. And, you know, like, they should be, okay, there's always going to be some tension, but, like, they should be able to benefit one another in a much greater way than they are at the moment. And I think if more people talk it normalizes the talk, and people become more used to players doing interviews. Players get more accustomed to doing interviews without feeling under any great pressure to do them because it's so rare. And if everybody talks, well then, there's a race to do the least. Like every time, I remember recently showing up at All Ireland semi-final press conferences, and a player gets pulled at the last minute because the manager found out that the other team that they're playing had only had 2 players up for interview, whereas they had 3. So you have this kind of well, we're not doing any more than they do, and that's kind of fair enough. But I think, in a situation where you have a governing body, I think there should be at least some sort of structure put on all of that.
That just sounds like damage limitation, and it also makes the media sound like absolute hounds. Like all we're trying to do is tell the stories and open the windows that people don't get to open, during the week, and shed some light on the stories around the game. So I do think that sometimes the media is painted in an awful light, and I'm not just talking about the GAA. I'm actually specifically not talking about the GAA. I think possibly more so in pro sports.
Yeah.
And like there's that thing again that you mentioned about the relationship between media and players, or media and coaches in pro sports. It absolutely should be necessary because there's so much money involved. It is literally their job to do some media, to do some PR, to do some flogging of runners or whatever it is. It's quite literally their job. And media organizations, particularly broadcast ones, pay rights, to get access. So I think it actually should be more so. And ironically, like particularly in professional rugby, a lot of the time it's very deadpan, and it's always off a script.
Yeah, I was absolutely
very frustrating.
I was really, really refreshed today to see the Brooks Koepka interview when he said about
that was brilliant.
And like the thing about it was the fact that he was insulting DeChambeau was not the thing that appealed to me. It was the fact that there was an athlete in a genuine moment of expression, and as I said, it's not just journalists that are fascinated by really good sports people. We're all kind of fascinated by them. Anybody who's interested in sport, like you hear 2 people at a bar talking about the same hurler for 3 hours. You know what I mean? Like we are invested in all these things. I think you hear an awful lot of modern columnists saying, "Oh well, there's no characters left in these games anymore." They are. They just withhold their character because that's kind of seen as a beneficial thing to do, and like that's not anybody's fault. That's not the player's fault, because if everybody does it, comes back to that word of culture. But I think it probably needs to start somewhere, and you'd imagine that an organizing body would be the best place to do it.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see whether that comes to pass. Would you have any, before we finish up, would you have any advice or advice is probably too narrow a phrase to put on it, but for people who are thinking about getting into sports journalism, who are probably maybe younger and starting out, would you be a doer? Would you be a fan of just go and do it and start writing, or pick up the pen, go to matches, or would you be more of the traditional kind of go to college, get a degree? Like what kind of?
No, like I went back, like I was doing business. I didn't like it, so I went back to Griffith College and studied it. Put it like no harm to Griffith College or anywhere else. Like I just got into it. I got a chance while I was in college, so I only just about finished college because I already started working for the Indo. So the thing is, you can go and do a journalism degree and you can learn a lot about the history of journalism and journalism as a concept. But it's like nobody, like none of us are artists, but it is a craft, and like any craft,
you learn on the job. The
best way to learn it is by doing it. But I think even before you do that, the most important thing is to figure out what you're good at. So like you might be a brilliant writer, but you have to be a really brilliant writer to get a job on the back of your brilliant writing ability. That there's very few people that are just going to coast straight into a job because they can write well. You have to be exceptional. But if, for instance, you have an active interest in, amateur golf in Ireland, if you're a good golfer and, you know who the next players are going to be on the Irish amateur golf, and that could be an area where you start off, because, like you have to think about what you have that's valuable, and if you have an active interest and you have a greater level of knowledge about a particular part of sport than the person on the street, well, that's what you sell. Because it can be all sorts of things. I was in college with a guy, Kevin Egan, who's now working
Oh, I
on.
know Kev. Yeah, Kev was with RTE for a while.
And he's working on Saturday Night Raw or something like that as a producer. But Kev always had that, I won't say cheesy American television presenter thing.
Yeah, he's great. Yeah,
you know, but that, yeah, but that, like I wouldn't be remotely surprised, you know. Whereas Kevin might have said that I had a bit more.
But he also found his niche, and that's what you're saying.
Yeah,
I'm always
exactly
telling people to find their niche, and he went to America, and he's married over there now to an American girl. But he went over there with a massive knowledge of European soccer, and that's kind of what his main stay is, or was anyway. Certainly he was basically commentating on soccer match, European Champions League.
Yeah, like I went to college with a lot of people then, for instance, who thought that their opinion as to why Jose Mourinho was going to be a better manager than Alex Ferguson was going to get them a job. Do you know what I mean? Like there's loads of people out there doing it, so unless you can do it as well as Ken Early can, you know, you're not going to kind of get a job for it. So you kind of have to, like, you know, getting stuck in is always the best way to go. Like, you know, it's been very hard, I would imagine, for journalists to get a start the last few years, because you can't even go in on work experience in most places now because there's restrictions going in. But just getting a handle on what the nuts and bolts of the job is always a good way to go. But previous to that, figure out what you're good at. You know, there are people who start off as writers that end up presenting radio programs, and there's people who want to get involved in television that actually realize that they're really good at writing written reports. So, you know, it's a trial and error thing, but I suppose essentially what you need to do is find what it is that you're good at, find what it is that you can offer. Because, you know, if you have an interest in a particular sport because you played it or it's in your family and you know more about it than most people do, well, you know, that could be the way to go. And like, once you're involved, then the industry expands, you know. Like the technology of how my stuff is published now is different to how it was when I started, but like effectively the nuts and bolts of the job are the same.
Do you think it's easier or harder now to get a start in sports media?
It's probably easier in that there's more media, you know, like, I mean, like, you know, we have a big enough reporting team, but there are people who work exclusively for the websites, and, you know, you can hear a radio program on RTE and there will be a written version of one of the interviews go up on the website. So I think there's a wider range of jobs than there were before involved in media. It hasn't quite happened yet, but I would imagine the kind of, you know, the digital video, the snap reports that people do on mobile phones, like that's obviously going to be a bigger thing to come. But it's funny, like the media industry itself is very sort of slow to move on to the next thing. Like for years in the Independent, we had, you know, people coming in who were going to tell us what the future of media as a business was, and then 6 months later another person would come in and tell us that it was, you know, and this just kept happening. And like, we only went behind the paywall last year, you know, in terms and like that's a huge thing for media, and I think it's a very positive thing for media, because if everything is for free, there's no value on it, and if there's no value on it, there's too much. And I think we are coming back to the stage where people are putting a value on media by paying for it, and by paying for it, I think people raise up the standard of journalism, you know. So from that point of view, I think the future journalism looks a bit more secure than it did a few years ago, before there was this migration to getting people to pay for it, because the way it was going wasn't really sustainable. So no, I would imagine that it's easier. But, you know, like if you're, for instance, you know, a soccer writer, or you're interested in writing about the Premier League, and that's the thing that really fascinates you, well, you know, there's all sorts of websites there that have statistics that are published straight after matches about, you know, like if you can break down why Pep Guardiola's press didn't work quite as well against Chelsea than it did, you know, versus how Mikel Arteta is trying to set up Arsenal, having worked with Guardiola, you know, that's a facility that you can access very, very easily now, that people 10 years ago would not have been able to do.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So I think, like, if you're clued into what you do, I think it's much easier to get going. And there's like the other thing is, I'm sure there were great potential journalists that never got a start, you know, whereas now, because with social media and everything else and blogs, you know, if you're good enough, people will definitely take notice.
I agree. I just think, you know, start writing or start a podcast, or, you know, start a YouTube channel or start something, because like the good people do get noticed, and that's kind of it's like a sense of justice or something as well, because there's more, like you said, there's more ways to get noticed now.
Yeah, I think it's more of a meritocracy than it used to be too. You know,
yeah, maybe, yeah.
People used to get jobs because, you know, they knew people, and I just don't think that's going to be the case anymore. Your stuff is you know, you'll be judged very quickly. That's the other thing. It's a very, very judgy industry. I could write a piece that's an opinion column, and it's only my opinion. And because people don't agree with that opinion, you'll have everybody on Twitter saying that you're a lazy journalist. And, you know, whether you are lazy or not, that's definitely not, you know, a sign of how lazy or otherwise that you are. So like your stuff is judged by people very, very quickly now. And I think,
and there's also so many more people writing, like, so there's so much out there that if it's not good, it's just not going to fly.
Yeah, like the only feedback we got for the first 10 years of me working in journalism was occasionally you get a letter that came in, you know, with a stamp on it and red pen scrawled at the front because you said something that annoyed somebody in the newspaper, whereas now it's instantaneous, you know. It's Twitter and it's, you know, people are able to get in touch with you in email. So look, I think it is more of a meritocracy now than it used to be. Like people aren't going to get into positions unless they're able to do their job, and it'll be very sort of quickly apparent whether they are or they aren't, you know. So no, I think it's more accessible than it was, but like the two things I think are going out and starting it off your own bat, and then the other thing is just find your niche, you know, figure out what it is that you're good at, because if you're interested enough in sport to want to make a career out of it, you definitely have one.
Yeah, okay, that's a good way to finish. Anyway, any way you can remember your favorite moment working in sport, your favorite day covering a match?
I'll pretend for a second that I can't remember, but no. I remember the 2011 All-Ireland football final in Croke Park, just because, you know, getting involved in sports journalism would have been because, you know, the Dublin footballers were the thing that I was most interested in. And I suppose it started in 2006, and it was 5 years of, you know, there was always a day of the year when there was a poll, and I was working for the Evening Herald, so it was very Dublin centric. So there was always a Monday in the year when there was a big post-mortem as to what had gone wrong and will they ever get one. And that was it was a surprise one. But some of those hurling matches as well, I think some of the All-Ireland hurling semi-finals we had in the last decade were just off the charts. Like, you were just like, what have I seen here? But for kind of magic, the other one I'd say is the 2013 hurling final replay. It was the first one that had been played on a Saturday night under lights. And Shane O'Donnell scored a hat-trick, and we'd no idea who Shane O'Donnell was. And it was just, I remember actually going, this is an incredible thing to watch, you know. So other than the parochial choice of the 2011 hurling football final, I think that's probably the one.
That was one of Peter McKennan's as well, would you believe?
Oh, right.
That hurling match, and the Longford Miners as well was another one of his. Conor, thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Cheers,
I think it'll be good for anybody who is thinking about getting into sports journalism. And I'm glad I got somebody who isn't cynical, because I think there's probably too much of that. But thanks a million, and I will talk to you soon.
Cheers, Evanne.